From Leipzig, Germany, hello and welcome to Mosaic, the video magazine of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I'm your host, Melissa Ramirez. For the past 250 years, the boys' choir at St. Thomas Church has sung the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. This is Bach's story told with words, pictures, and of course, music. Our journey takes us across central Germany, from Bach's ancestral home in Eisenach to Ohrdruf and Lüneburg, where he grew up. We'll also trace the growth of his musical career in Arnstadt, Muhlhausen, Weimar, Kothen, and finally Leipzig. Johann Sebastian Bach lived from 1685 to 1750. Changes revolutionized Europe. Advances in science, politics, and literature affected kings and commoners alike. It was an age of fine arts, architecture, and a time of celebrating the human spirit. In England, Sir Isaac Newton was laying the foundations of modern science. In France, Voltaire wrote Candide, and most of Germany was still known as the Holy Roman Empire. French, German, Italian, Dutch, and English artists were busy painting up a storm. In architecture, the Palace of Versailles set the tone for an entire age. Composers such as Handel, Telemann, and Vivaldi were famous. Bach's day was a flurry of creative excitement. Rich nobles constantly tried to outdo one another. They embellished clothes, houses, and lifestyles with ruffles and flourishes. Any prince worth his powdered wig had a staff of hired musicians. And whether your castle was in Germany or Scotland, French was the preferred language of the court. As far as music went, there wasn't much separation between secular and sacred. Music written and performed both in the king's chapel and the village square glorified God. And if the king shared a bit of the spotlight, so be it. Changes didn't affect everyone, however. Parts of Europe were still quite medieval. Feudal lords ruled over illiterate serfs who tilled soil they didn't own. And if the prince was Protestant, chances are you were too. Johann Sebastian Bach was born into a large musical family. He was the youngest son of Maria Elisabeth and Johann Ambrosius Bach, a prosperous town musician here in Eisenach. It was here, 200 years before, that Martin Luther made his famous translation of the New Testament in the Wartburg Castle overlooking the city.
Bach grew up in the same town where Luther grew up as a student. He actually went to the same school as a boy and sang in the same boys' choir. So he grew up in the central Lutheran region of Germany, and in particular in a place that had many traces of Lutheran traditions.
The first thing that would have struck Bach growing up is that I'm a Bach. And that means that he was a musician. He had to be a musician because so many relatives, uncles, cousins, they were all in the music business. He couldn't have avoided the business of making music.
There were church musicians, there were city musicians, court musicians, cantors, organists, instrumentalists, instrument makers. They were in the business of music, and they inherited it from their forebears, and they passed it on to their offspring.
Johann Sebastian spent his first 9 years in a large house in Eisenach. The family wasn't rich, but they weren't poor either. Their life revolved around family, music, school, and the church. Then, tragedy struck.
His mother dies. There are some financial problems. And then a year after his second marriage, Johann Ambrosius himself dies, which leaves the young Bach an orphan.
Johann Sebastian watched 4 of his siblings die before the age of 19. Then his parents died too. Long life was by no means a guarantee, a reality Johann Sebastian was reminded of again and again. Now orphaned, Johann Sebastian and his 13-year-old brother, Johann Jacob, moved to the nearby town of Ohrdruf, where the boy's oldest brother, Johann Christoph, was organist at St. Michael's Church.
The family network was a very protective net, and that helped Bach grow up, I think, in a rather happy way.
The 9-year-old Johann Sebastian couldn't keep his hands off music, even if it was locked away.
He'd get up at night and go downstairs and visit the bookcase of his brother, the bookcase where the music was kept, but it's kept locked. It had diagonal sort of wire frame over it. Being a young 9-year-old, he was there to get his hands in, then roll up the manuscripts, and then pull them out, unroll them, lay them out on the table by the window where the moonlight was coming through, and he would copy these works because he wanted to learn. He wanted to understand this music, and what you do is you copy the stuff out. You understand what's going on. But his brother caught him doing it, and had to wave the finger at him.
While living with his older brother, Johann Sebastian now continued his education at Ohrdruf's Latin school. He did so well and showed such promise as a student and a singer that by the age of 15 he earned a university scholarship at the prestigious St. Michael's School in Lüneburg.
Lüneburg was one of the best schools, academically speaking. So the academic training Bach received in languages, in science, in poetics, and in geography was very special.
While at school in Lüneburg, Johann Sebastian tapped into a thriving music scene 30 miles away in Hamburg, then Germany's largest city. The most famous organist of the time was Johann Adam Reinken.
He became Bach's early idol, and Bach traveled several times from Lüneburg to Hamburg in order to learn from Reinken, and Reinken probably was instrumental in introducing Bach to the art of organ building, so that at a fairly early age Bach became an expert organ scholar.
With formal education in Lüneburg behind him, Johann Sebastian was now a well-educated and versatile musician. He can read and write music, sing, play, and repair just about any keyboard instrument. Ready to set out on his own, he needed to look no further than his own backyard.
His first job, very brief job, is in Weimar, at the court, and he was to play wearing a Hungarian shirt and uniform. And then when the position in Arnstadt becomes available, he applies for the position and gets it on two grounds. One is that he is a Bach, and the Bachs were stretching way back, connection with Arnstadt. It was a Bach town. But also, he's fairly young for quite an important position, but he clearly had the ability to hold the job down as organist.
He had been hired originally as a consultant for the design of the organ. That was when Bach was only 17 years of age. That's quite amazing to consider a 17-year-old consulting on an organ that was built by a master builder who was over 50 years.
Armed with a new instrument and time to play it, Johann Sebastian's talent blossomed. He devoted himself to composing and performing music. He plays the organ 3 times a week in church and led a local choir. That duty led to a brawl with bassoonist Geyersbach.
Bach apparently came from an engagement at the castle. He was wearing a sword, which meant that he must have worn it as part of his uniform in court service.
There's a brawl. Nobody seemed to know who started it. He started it. No, he started it.
We know their ages. They were 22, 23, 24 years old and had not yet graduated. While Bach, the 18-year-old organist, had graduated, from Latin school at age 17. So there was a certain jealousy, also, a feeling of superiority on the part of Bach.
The accusation was that Bach had called Geyersbach a zippofagottist, which means an idiot or incompetent bassoonist.
Johann Sebastian had other problems with his employers here in Arnstadt. He requested a 1-month leave of absence to visit famous organist Dietrich Buxtehude. That visit stretched into 3 months. When he returned, an angry congregation was shocked by newfangled styles of music the young organist brought back with him. On top of everything else, Johann Sebastian was unfairly accused for allowing an unfamiliar maiden to sing in the choir loft. In those days, women were not allowed to sing in church. Now his days in Arnstadt were numbered, but bigger and better things awaited in Muhlhausen. Johann Sebastian's second major post came as organist in this free imperial city. It was here that he began to refine his skill as a composer, writing large-scale works like God is Our King. Since the Muhlhausen job meant a pay raise, the 23-year-old was ready to wed his second cousin, Maria Barbara Bach, at this church in Dornheim. The marriage produced 4 children who survived to adulthood. Wilhelm Friedemann and Carl Philipp Emanuel both went on to become famous composers in their own rights. In Muhlhausen, Johann Sebastian found himself in the middle of the biggest religious controversy of his day, orthodoxy versus pietism.
The fights between the Orthodox and the Pietists were conducted, by doctrinaire theologians on either side. But for people like Bach, there was some truth in both movements.
Pietists saw faith as personal and life-changing. The Orthodox tended to be more understated and traditional. Johann Sebastian served 2 churches in Muhlhausen, one pietistic, the other Orthodox. All Bach wanted to do was glorify God with his music.
Bach was interested in making music for the people, not music, for the religious leaders. And I think that made a difference, and I think it probably was clearly reflected in the response to his music.
Fed up with religious squabbling in Muhlhausen, he decided to take advantage of his growing reputation and find a new job. The opportunity came as a court organist here in Weimar, a leading German cultural center. Previously, the young genius made do with local town musicians. In Weimar, they were professionals.
Town musicians tended to be jacks of all trades, pick up any instrument that needs to be played and will play it. A court was a more refined atmosphere.
The city of Weimar was the seat of a duchy. That meant the land was controlled by a duke, in this case, 2 dukes. Not only did Johann Sebastian have professional musicians to work with, but the job was prestigious. It nearly doubled his salary. The best part, his employer loved music. Johann Sebastian's musical output flourished. He experimented with the works of Italian composer Antonio Vivaldi and wrote numerous cantatas and organ works, such as Christ Lay in Death Strong Bands and the Little Organ Book.
Bach is almost a kind of patron saint for church musicians. All around the world, he is recognized as one of the greatest composers that ever lived. He spent his entire life in Germany and was greatly influenced by the legacy of Martin Luther. Luther himself had been a musician declaring music to be second only to the gospel itself. Bach was to be the Reformer's greatest musical disciple.
You're just blown away by the quality of the music at several levels. The music makes a strong emotional impact and an immediate impact on you. But the more you begin to look at it, how it is put together, the layering he does, and how he achieves that, it becomes more amazing.
The Weimar period for Bach was perhaps the most important one on his way to really becoming a great musician.
At this time, his skills as a keyboard player are now becoming legendary. He clearly is a remarkable performer, and a lot of the performances are clearly were of his own works or improvisations.
Johann Sebastian's fame spread throughout Europe. This, of course, led to a promotion.
In the February of 1714, all of a sudden, his title is changed at the Weimar court, and his duties change. No longer is he simply a court organist. He is now named concertmaster. There was a French organist by the name of Louis Marchand who was celebrated by a lot of people. There was a sense of, oh, this is this French organist, wonderful stuff. He was in Dresden and creating quite a stir, and so somebody suggested, well, we've got Bach. Shouldn't we hear these two on the same occasion?
As the story goes, Bach traveled to Dresden and practiced for the contest, and apparently behind the door, Mr. Marchand was listening. He somehow got cold feet and must have decided, well, this contest is not winnable, so he left town.
Johann Sebastian was not only a master performer, he was rapidly becoming a master composer. Back in Weimar, the now famous Johann Sebastian missed out on a promotion when his boss hired a relative to fill the court's top musical post. Johann Sebastian's response landed him in jail.
He gets a new job as Kapellmeister, which is the highest position you can get as a musician, at the court of Kothen. But his employer, the Duke, is annoyed with him and so has him arrested for 3 or 4 weeks so that he will come to his senses and stay, but he doesn't, and eventually he's released and off he goes to Kothen.
As Kapellmeister, Johann Sebastian was now at the top of his profession. Personally, the 32-year-old musician's family had grown as well. He and Maria Barbara now had 4 children under the age of 10. Kothen was a small principality in Anhalt-Kothen. Compared with Halle or Leipzig, it was a backwater. On the bright side, the reformed Prince Leopold loved music and the arts. When the nearby Prussian king fired his court musicians, Leopold seized the opportunity and hired a large contingent for himself. Life for the Bach family in Kothen began well. Johann Sebastian worked in this castle. He performed for the prince and for the church. He also wrote 6 concertos for the Margrave Christian Ludwig of Brandenburg. We know them well as the Brandenburg Concertos. Sadly, it was also a time of tragedy for the Bach family. Returning home from a business trip of several weeks with Prince Leopold, Johann Sebastian learned that his beloved Maria Barbara, whom he had left in good health, had died and been buried.
It is very hard to imagine the degree of shock that Bach must have experienced in coming home. The children probably telling him that their mother, was no longer.
More than a year after Maria Barbara's death, Johann Sebastian fell in love. She was a young professional court singer named Anna Magdalena Wilke.
Anna Magdalena Bach is more than a wife to Bach. She is his partner, collaborator, organizer. She was a singer. She understood his music. For example, at one point, a score of the unaccompanied cello suites was thought to be in his own hand. Now it turns out to be her handwriting. It was so similar to his.
From what we can tell, that Bach promoted the professional ambitions of his wife. He took her on a number of trips later on, and he was clearly very proud of her musical accomplishments.
In 1723, Johann Sebastian, his new wife, and growing family left Kothen and moved here to Leipzig. It was the peak of his career. Leipzig's major attraction was its university. Johann Sebastian wanted his sons to further their education, and this may be part of his reason for moving here. Johann Sebastian was hired as cantor or chief musician at the St. Thomas Church and School. Ironically, he was the third choice. George Philipp Telemann and Christoph Grabner both turned down the job. They had to make do with Johann Sebastian Bach.
He kept his title as Kapellmeister from Kothen, so he conducted his cantorate in a Kapellmeisterly fashion, and basically became a self-styled music director of the city of Leipzig. He was overseeing the town musicians, he was overseeing the other churches, and he had a very commanding position for 27 years in Leipzig that changed musical life in that city totally.
In some respects, Johann Sebastian's Leipzig post was a step down compared with Kothen and Weimar. He no longer served in a prince's court. The Leipzig musicians he worked with were amateurs, not professionals. Yet he not only made the most of the situation, he triumphed. Johann Sebastian's Leipzig work represents one of the greatest musical achievements in Christendom. It was in Leipzig that Johann Sebastian wrote the St. Matthew, St. Mark, and St. John Passions. A passion is simply a musical way of telling the story of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection in a worship service. While only two, St. Matthew and St. John, survive today, both rank as classics.
Even when you put together the Passions, B minor Mass, Art of Fugue, Musical Offering, all monuments, these pale in proportion to the cantatas. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful music. Equal to anything. We all have our favorite compositions about Brandenburg concertos, all B minor Mass, all Matthew Passion, large works which, obviously spent a long time putting them together, but the wonderful moments within each of these works you can find in the cantatas. For him, composition was to be involved in an act of creation that was a pale imitation, I think he would say, of the creativity of God.
Bach said, and I quote, "The aim and final reason of all music is none else but the glory of God." That's been a great example to me all my life. And Bach would frequently initial his blank manuscript pages with the markings J period, which meant in Latin, Jesus help me.
And when he finished, he put at the end SDG, Soli Deo Gloria, glory to God alone.
Johann Sebastian continued to compose at a phenomenal rate until his last days. In his 65th year, following two unsuccessful eye operations, the now blind master died following a stroke. He left behind Anna Magdalena and 9 children. 4 of them were still minors. In the decades following his death, Johann Sebastian's music began to be replaced by newer, more popular styles. Composers such as Mozart, Beethoven, and even Johann Sebastian's sons, Carl Philipp Emanuel and Johann Christian, called the English Bach, became popular throughout Europe.
Bach's music played a major role for other professional musicians. Mozart and Beethoven and Haydn had a great respect for Bach's art.
Beethoven said that his name should not have been Bach. It should really have been Meer. In other words, not brook, little stream, but ocean.
His last work, dictated from his bed, was a chorale entitled "Before Thy Throne I Come." His prayer, Soli Deo Gloria, was certainly answered. He died in relative obscurity, and his grave was not even marked. God did get all the glory during Bach's lifetime, but his productivity forged a musical legacy which the great composer Wagner would someday appraise as the most stupendous miracle in all of music.
Bach's music speaks to me more directly than anyone else's music. It is the deep spirituality that Bach's music, whether it's with words or without words, is really penetrating every score of Bach that touches one directly and immediately.
In 1829, 79 years after Johann Sebastian's death, German composer Felix Mendelssohn performed the St. Matthew's Passion. It sparked a revival that has influenced the music of every generation since. Thanks for watching. This is Mosaic, and you're part of it.